name is Eugene Chung. I'm the founder and CEO of Penrose Studios. My mother is an accountant, a CPA, and my father is an opera singer. So I've always had this mix of, analytical and creative, what people call left brain and right brain. So on one side, I would, learn how to program and, learn technology. On the other side, I was into theater, I was into film and cinema, and this is all very important parts of my life. But because my dad is an opera singer, I've always wondered at how art forms change over time in society. And so if we think about opera, I grew up in the suburbs of Virginia. And when I was growing up in the suburbs of Virginia, I found that people didn't really watch a whole lot of opera. But I did go back and I looked at the history books, and I found that opera used to be a major art form, right? So 150 years ago, if you rewind the clock, in the middle of the 1800s, the 1850s, opera was a sort of great big art form, right? When you think about it, it had sort of the biggest audience, it had these sort of great big productions, the biggest stars. And people, in fact, called it at the time sort of the ideal work of art because it combined the best of, narrative, the best characters, the best stories, the best music. And a lot of people thought, how can anything ever get beyond opera? But then a few decades later, in the 1890s, the very first film cameras came about and they started capturing the first moving pictures. And I always wondered, will I ever live to see the next transformation? And I never thought that I would, right? Because if you think about it, we've had thousands of years of stage plays. We've had hundreds of years of opera. And now, in 2017, this year, we have 121 years of moving picture. And so the idea that we would live, I even lived to see in my lifetime a transformation was something that I just didn't think was possible. And this was true until about a few years ago when I encountered virtual reality. When I went and saw the early Oculus prototypes, what they called the DK1, and that was enough to get me excited to create the company. I ended up joining Oculus instead as head of film and media, where I ended up co-founding something called Oculus Story Studio, and made some of the very first films in VR. We got acquired by Facebook, and after that, about a year and a half ago, ended up creating a new company called Penrose Studios. And we've created 3 virtual reality films to date. The Rose and I was our first piece. The second piece was a film called Allumette. And the third, which is in progress, is a film called Arden's Wake. We really believe that with virtual reality, with augmented reality, mixed reality, these are completely new art forms. And so we actually have to go and define the language around how to tell, stories or even experiences or whatever it is that we're going to call the ultimate form of what this art form will become. And that's not an easy task. We're combining the best of what we know from, movies, cinema. We're combining the best of what we know from video games, interactivity. And, there's often a third thing that is not often talked about, but theater, stage plays, and even opera. Very important things, right? It's almost like you take certain lessons from each of these, you try to combine them to create a brand new language. We look at history, and what we find is that with every new medium that comes about, it's very difficult for people who are real experts in a different kind of art form to switch to another one. We found this in the early days of cinema. A lot of stage play directors try to transition to film, and very few of the really good ones in stage succeeded in transitioning to film, almost none. And this is because you have to think so differently, right? And when you're so advanced in your field, it's hard to figure out, to know what the unknowns are. There's a 70s film director, Pasolini, and Pasolini is one of the few film directors that was able to transition from one artistic medium where he excelled at it and then was able to transition to another one. And he was a poet actually before he was a film director. So Pasolini started his artistic endeavors by writing poetry, and he was quite good at it. But then he transitioned to cinema, And he actually defines it, he spent some time talking about that transition. He defines it as sort of the language of poetry, which we're not talking about the language in the sense of English or French, but the language, the grammar of the art form of poetry is so different from the language of cinema, and trying to transition that for him was an incredibly difficult task. And he talks about how difficult that was, right? And I think it's underappreciated how difficult those transitions are. And so when we look at someone like as talented as Pasolini and understand how difficult it was for him to transition those things, it starts to give you a hint at how difficult it is to really try to, transition from one art form to another in terms of being able to understand the grammar and the language. So it is our sort of thesis that, it's really the Wild West when it comes to virtual, augmented, mixed reality content. And, as we look to the future, it's going to be people who are native thinkers, the people who think natively in this medium, in AR, VR, MR, whether they came to it via another language, possible but hard, or they grew up with it. I think we always fundamentally believe that, narrative storytelling would be big in this space, right? So in just the very earliest days when I was first getting into VR, I was part of a company that was mostly made up of people from the video game world. And I personally love video games. I think we have a lot to learn from video games when it comes to the creation of VR, AR, and MR experiences. But how do we tell stories in the space, and can we tell stories in this space? And I think our unequivocal answer to that is yes. And we're answering that question not by just saying yes, but by creating stories. And I think that's the important thing, to go and create that and showcase that you can, in fact, tell stories in the space, stories that are impactful, stories that move people, stories that satisfy sort of, the age-old question and criteria of what stories are. And it is also our belief that stories are going to be the thing that really push this medium into the mainstream. The video game market, as a whole, is very large. It's a over $100 billion industry, growing very large globally today. But the narrative market, if you count in, in-home television and cinema, is a $400 billion plus market. It's over 4 times the size of video games. And that should be no surprise because of the fact that there are more people who watch, a television show or go to the movies than play Call of Duty, for example. We think that with VR and AR, a lot of sort of the early development has been focused on video games, but we think that that's going to flip once we get to the mass market. Because stories are something that we've been doing since, we were, people living in caves and drawing on cave walls and sitting around campfires when we were, in sort of ancient times and telling stories to each other. And that's something that's sort of fundamental to the human experience. I don't think that's going to go away. And we think that this medium is uniquely adapted to be able to tell unique new stories, similar to the way we've been doing for tens of thousands of years, but just in a brand new format. Presence is part of the big magic of VR. In a movie, you have a rectangular screen, and whether you're watching it on your phone or watching in a movie theater, and in some ways, it's better if you are sort of outside of your body, right? So whenever you watch a movie in a movie theater, you're typically focused in that world. And if someone next to you in that dark theater rattles their keychain or takes out their phone and starts playing a mobile game, you suddenly start to get out of that experience, right? So there's this really fundamental thing where presence, which is you being present in a theater, suddenly taking you out of the story, means that there's sort of this conflict, or at least it's not an unresolvable conflict, but it's certainly a conflict between presence and storytelling. And that's actually been one of the really key issues and problems with storytelling inside of virtual reality today, right? It's if you're present in the space, I can look around me, I can look to my left, my right, and I see everything around me. And so now I'm in the space. But if I'm in the space, how do I then interact with the space, right? And that's not a question that comes or arises when you're watching a movie, because you know that you're almost outside of your body watching this rectangular screen. And so I think this is the thing that we have to work to try to solve. I think it's one of the hardest questions to answer in VR. It's a very simple question, but it's a difficult question, is who are we supposed to be in the virtual space? This is the thing that I think, will take years and years of just trying and developing and figuring out what sort of works. We don't really have a whole lot of rules, so to speak, because there's so many things in the space that we learn as a rule one day and then we contravene that rule the next. So I think we're always open to figuring out what works and what does not through iterative development. But I think one thing that's core to us is authenticity when we want to tell a story. Because I think the audience can tell when you're telling an inauthentic story, right? And what I don't mean is accuracy necessarily or fact, because we're clearly telling things in a animated CG world where it's fiction, right? But potentially even particularly in fiction, where there's constructs and stories getting made up, whether it's in a novel or a play or a movie or a VR piece, the authenticity of what characters are doing and how they act and transform, that is something that is core to get right in any art form that you do. And this is something that I think the audience can sort of preternaturally, sense when something is awry, whether it's in a movie or a book, right? I mean, we never want to underestimate the audience and their intelligence and their ability to understand those things. So, a lot of the challenge can be if you are crafting a story and seeing how things develop and you say, okay, well, is that authentic? Is that authentic to the world, to the character that we built? Is that the right authentic action? We're so early in this medium that I think it's hard to know what the quote rules are around length. So for example, in the early days of film, one of the first films that we have an example for, which is the Lumiere brothers' train coming into La Ciotat station, is about 45 seconds long. It's very short. And a lot of movies in those early days, what you might call movies, were very short. A few seconds here, a few seconds there, maybe a minute here. And it was in the early, a few years in when people started developing things like The Great Train Robbery, which is about 11 minutes or so long. And it was, sort of the early phases of like a, somewhat 3-act-ish narrative. And then not too long after that, people said, okay, well, 90 minutes, 2 hours, let's go target that. I think with VR, we have to go find what those ideal time blocks are. That question is so open today that it could be anywhere from a minute, 10 minutes, an hour, 10 hours, right? I guess the question is who knows, right? I mean, at some point you'll probably fade from exhaustion, right? But there's kind of that real openness as to what could potentially work. And until we hone in on those things, I don't think we should at the outset say, okay, because we know film has, or television is this format, that we're going to then put that box around virtual reality and say, well, VR pieces should then be this format. I think that we should go the other direction and build from the ground up. Our long-term view, just our thoughts around the industry as a whole, is that we see virtual, mixed, augmented reality, this whole industry. First off, we see them all converging, right? We think that there's going to be this single device that sort of does them all, and that's going to be lightweight and easy to access. And once we get to that point, which we think is a ways away, at least that integrated device, we think that this thing has the potential to be the next major computing platform, right? So we're entering a world where we're creating a brand new art form and a brand new computing platform, and those will come hand in hand together. And that's a really exciting time for us, right? In the last 60 years, we've had 5 major computing platforms. In the 1960s, we started with the mainframe. A decade after that, we came to the mini computer, we had the personal computer, desktop internet, and now we live in the era of mobile internet or smartphones. And that, every sort of cycle has generated, 10 times the number of users as the prior cycle. And we think there's a huge opportunity here that this will be the big thing, right? When you leave your home and you don't have your phone or your computer on you, but you have this device that can, basically let you do anything and interact with the world in any way you want. That's an incredibly exciting future to look forward to. And, we're building for what that's going to be. We're at the foundation and the birth of a new art form, but also at the birth of a new societal shift that I think is even sort of underestimated at this point. There's so much attention paid on VR, so much media attention, but the media attention goes in ups and downs and things like that. But when we think about how few people have experienced VR and how even fewer own a VR headset or an AR headset or an MR headset, many of which don't even exist right now, certainly not available to the consumer, like that's a very, very tiny number. When you think about how much better these devices are going to get, and the potential that they have to be the most personal computing device that we've ever had, that's a really exciting thing to think about. And that's going to be this huge shift that I think, again, is on a long-term basis underestimated, right? So the impact of what that's going to be. So we're excited to see what that's going to end up becoming. And, I think it's a really interesting future to think about and plan for.